The station exhaled, and Ashkani felt it through her boots. Not metaphor. Literal exhalation, a slow pressure differential moving through the calcium resin floor beneath her magnetic soles, the way a sleeping animal's ribs might expand if the animal were the size of a small moon and its lungs were corridors. She had read the briefing. She had not believed the briefing. She believed it now. The docking corridor had contracted around her shuttle during approach, the walls narrowing by 11 centimeters over 4 minutes, according to her suit telemetry, and then expanding again as she was guided gently, inexorably through into the body of the Veth Conclave Station. Through, she thought, was precisely the right word. The station had swallowed her. She was standing in its throat. The translation apparatus hung from her belt. A lozenge of gray metal the size of her fist, configured for Veth chemical vibrational output. It was experimental. Everything about this mission was experimental. Humanity had been talking to the Veth for 11 months. Or rather, humanity had been attempting to talk to the Veth while the Veth observed the attempts with the patient interest of researchers watching a cell culture grow. She stepped forward into the main reception chamber and stopped. The walls were not walls. They were the Veth. 40,000 polyps arranged across every surface, floor, ceiling. The curved columns that were not columns but load-bearing extensions of the station's own body. Each polyp was roughly the size of her thumb, translucent amber gold, connected to every other by filaments so fine they bent light. 40,000 small mouths, 40,000 small eyes, one mind, wearing 40,000 faces, all of them turned toward her. Her suit registered the vibration before she heard it, a deep structural hum moving through the floor, rising through her boots, her legs, the base of her spine. The translation apparatus clicked once and went silent. Ashkani waited. Then she raised her right hand, palm outward. The hum stopped. Every polyp on the nearest wall oriented simultaneously, the motion like wind, moving across a field of grass, and her gesture was recorded in 40,000 pairs of eyes. The translation apparatus clicked again, then emitted a sequence of tones so low she felt them in her molars rather than heard them. The Veth's response came back as fragmented text across her visor. Unit. Isolated. Function. She almost laughed. Not out of disrespect, out of recognition. Every first contact, she had been told, asked some version of this question. What are you for? What role do you serve in the structure? Where is the rest of you? Xenobiologist, she said. My name is Ashkani. I represent Earth. The apparatus stuttered. Earth. Single node world. Confirms. One organism present. Confirms. This organism speaks for all? Not for all, she said carefully. For many. The Veth were quiet for a long time. She watched their collective attention move across her, not in sequence, not in waves, but simultaneously, every polyp processing in parallel, the distributed mind turning its full attention to the creature standing in its throat. Her biosign monitor registered her own heart rate at 92 beats per minute, a single rhythm, one drum in an empty hall. She became aware, from something she could not name, some peripheral sensitivity sharpened by years of fieldwork on 6 worlds, that the question they had asked was not really a question, it was a diagnosis. They had looked at her and read the answer before she gave it, and the answer had disturbed them. She reached out and touched the wall. She did it without thinking, a gesture as natural to her as breathing. The same impulse that had made her pet a research subject's fur on Ganymede, that made her press her hand to a tree's bark on the forest worlds, just to feel the texture of something alive. Her palm made contact with the surface of the nearest column, and the filaments of 100 polyps touched the back of her glove. Every polyp on every surface recoiled simultaneously, a wave of revulsion moving outward from her hand at the speed of their shared nervous system. The floor heaved not violently, more like a flinch, and she stumbled, caught herself, kept her hand where it was. A single polyp detached from the column, drifting on its filament like a leaf on a thread, and hung in the air 6 centimeters from her gloved fingers. It stayed there. Then it retreated, drawing itself back into the colony, and the translation apparatus rendered the elder cluster's response in fragments. "Why do you not dissolve?" Ashkani looked at the 40,000 faces looking back at her. I don't know what that means," she said. And that was the truth, and the beginning of everything. They kept asking her the same question in 17 different grammatical structures, as if the answer might change shape. She had been given quarters, a section of the station's interior that the Veth had prepared by pulling their polyps back from the walls and allowing a pocket of empty space to exist, which was apparently as alien to them as her single body was to her. The chamber breathed. She slept in it for 4 hours and woke to the sensation of the floor expanding beneath her like a chest rising, and lay still in her sleeping bag and felt the rhythm of it slow, vast, utterly indifferent. The formal exchange began on the second day, the xenobiology session. She would share data on Earth's biosphere. They would share corresponding data on the Veth Conclave. This was the official reason for her presence. This was, she had been told by her mission briefing, the most any human had achieved in Veth space. The session began in a wider chamber than the reception hall, its surfaces alive with denser clusters of polyps, their amber gold color deepening toward amber brown where the concentrations were highest. The Veth had arranged subclusters along the walls in what she was beginning to recognize as their version of a meeting table, not gathered around a space, but gathered at its edges. The space itself serving as the subject of attention. In the center of that space, something was dying. A cluster of perhaps 2,000 polyps had separated from the main wall colony. Separated was not quite right. They were still connected by filaments, but the filaments were thinning, losing tension, the way a web goes slack when its anchor points fail. The cluster hung in the chamber's center, like a lantern, with its light going out, and the Veth around the walls were watching it with the quality of attention that Ashkani had learned to recognize on research stations when a long-term experiment was reaching its conclusion. She crouched, because crouching was how her body got closer to something without threatening it, and she watched. The dying cluster's movements had become irregular. The coordinated ripple that healthy Veth displayed in their polyps was disintegrating into noise, individual polyps moving independently, losing the chemical signal that kept them synchronized with the whole. She had read about this. Sub-colony senescence. The Veth collective body shed and regenerated subclusters the way human skin shed cells, but at a scale that carried something the briefing notes had described in clinical language as socio-cultural significance. The briefing had not told her what it felt like to watch. She stayed crouched and quiet for a long time. Her body did the thing bodies do. Her cortisol elevated, her heart rate climbed, her breathing changed. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible. Just the body's quiet acknowledgement that something was ending, the same neurochemical shift that happened when she sat with a dying research subject, or read about the extinction of a species she had never met. She asked quietly, carefully, through the apparatus, whether it hurt. The translation matrix froze. Then it emitted an error tone she had not heard before. 3 descending pulses that meant, she would later learn, that the query had no target in the Veth semantic structure. Not that the answer was unknown, that the question was unformed, like asking for the color of a silence. 2 subclusters on the walls began debating in the chemical vibrational register she couldn't follow. The apparatus caught fragments. Malfunction in observer. Anomalous resonance. No chemical gradient links her to the dying cluster. No signal compels her observation. One cluster's response. She resonates. Ashkani was watching the dying cluster and not watching the debate. The cluster's movements were almost gone now, a flutter, a stillness, a flutter again. The chemical signal failing polyp by polyp from the edges inward. She pressed her gloved hand flat against the floor, not touching the cluster, just present. The way you were present when something was ending. The way every human instinct said you stayed. 3 hours. The cluster completed its senescence cycle in 3 hours, and she stayed for all of them. In the last moments, one of the dying cluster's outermost polyps extended a filament across the floor toward her boot. A reflex, possibly. Possibly not. She did not move away. The elder cluster's signal came after the filament went still, fragmented, uncertain, moving through the translation apparatus in pieces that didn't quite assemble. She waited for the syntax to settle. It did not settle. What arrived instead was a quality of attention. 40,000 pairs of eyes pulled back from her, not in the way they had recoiled from her touch, but in a different way, a way she had no word for, as if they needed distance in order to see her properly. She stayed where she was, crouched on the floor of the chamber, and the station breathed around her, and she thought, they have never had anyone stay before. Every species that has visited has observed, measured, cataloged. No one has ever just stayed. She didn't know if that was the right thing. She only knew it was the true thing, and that, for her, had always been the same. The crisis came from inside the station, as crises at the Veth Conclave always did, because the station was alive, and living things break from within. The alarm, such as it was, reached Ashkani not as sound but as a change in the station's breathing, a skip in the rhythm, a held breath. She had been awake for an hour, eating a ration pack in her pocket of empty space, when the floor under her shifted, not the slow expansion she had grown accustomed to, but a sharp contraction, like a muscle seizing. She grabbed her kit by pure reflex and was moving toward the sound of Veth distress before she knew what she was moving toward. The load-bearing biofilament network, the structural connective tissue that ran through the station's interior the way tendons run through a body, was failing in Sector 4. She learned this from the apparatus, which was receiving Veth chemical signals in panicked bursts, the translation fragmentary and fast, cascade failure, structural compromise, 3 sub-colonies isolated. Calculate optimal sacrifice. That last phrase arrived in her apparatus like cold water. She found the breach point, a hub junction where 12 major filament cables converged, and where a calcium resin anchor had cracked stress fracture, structural fatigue, the kind of failure that happens in living buildings the way arthritis happens in joints. 3 sub-colonies on the far side of the breach were cut off, their chemical signals reaching the main body only as distorted static through the compromised filaments. The Veth were already responding with the elegance of a superorganism that had solved this problem 100 times before. Redistribution, reroute load to adjacent filament networks. Isolation. Sever the compromised cables cleanly. Sacrifice. The 3 cut-off sub-colonies would be released. The math was brutal, and it was correct. 3 clusters against the structural integrity of the whole. Ashkani looked at the breach. She looked at her kit. She had geological survey equipment, structural repair foam rated for silicate and calcium carbonate substrates, a sonic probe, and 11 years of field work that had taught her the difference between a structure you could save and a structure you had to abandon. This one she could save. She pushed into the compromised section before any Veth could stop her. They couldn't stop her physically. She was faster than the chemical signal, telling the filaments to part for her, and she hit the breach with both hands and her geology probe and started working. The repair foam was designed for cave systems and mineral structures, not for living tissue, but calcium resin was calcium resin, and the biochemistry was close enough. She sealed the crack in the anchor, while the station tried to compensate around her. The walls flexing, the ceiling dropping 4 centimeters in the time it took her to apply the first bead of foam. She kept working. She used her body to brace 2 filament cables apart while the foam cured, her back against one, her hands on the other, taking the tension load herself while the chemistry set. The section was not stable. The apparatus was telling her this in the Veth's fragments. 1 organism insufficient. Probability of survival 12%. Advise retreat. She kept working. Her suit reported a laceration along her left forearm where a snapping filament had caught her. Not deep, not serious. The suit's self-seal had already closed around it, but the biosign monitor recorded the event, and the station's sensory mesh, she knew, recorded everything that happened within its body. She spliced 3 of the 5 severed filament junctions using the probe's micro-welding function, not perfect, not permanent, but load-bearing, enough to reconnect 2 of the 3 isolated subcolonies to the main body's chemical network. The 3rd junction was beyond her reach. The angle wrong. The walls too close. She got 2. She came back out of the section covered in calcium resin dust and her own dried blood and sat down hard against the wall, and her legs did not want to work for a moment. The walls moved. Not a flinch this time. The polyp colonies on both sides of the corridor parted away from her, a slow, deliberate motion, clearing a space around her that had not been there before, as if she had weight that needed room, as if she had demonstrated something that required acknowledgement. She was still breathing too fast. Her hands were shaking slightly, the post-adrenaline tremor she'd had since her 20s, the one that meant the crisis was over and her body was only now allowed to tell her it had been afraid. The Elder Cluster's signal moved through the floor. Witness. Just that. 1 word. Untranslated. Which meant it had no translation, it was the thing itself. The concept raw, the Veth sending a signal not to her. She realized, slowly, but outward. To the Galactic Conclave Network. She looked at her hands. The repair foam was set hard, gray-white, against her glove's dark material. The lacerations on her forearm had stopped bleeding. She wondered if they understood that the math had never mattered to her, that the 12% had not been a reason to stop, that she had not calculated whether the 3 cut-off clusters were worth her survival because the math that humans ran was not the math the Veth ran, and the difference between those 2 calculations was something she was only beginning to find words for. The Keth Ural fleet arrived without announcement, which was how they always arrived. Ashkani learned of them through the station's reaction before the apparatus caught up. A systemic tension in the floor, in the walls, in the slow breathing rhythm that had become background to her days. The Veth Conclave had a word for the particular quality of that tension. She'd heard it in their chemical register often enough to recognize its signature and the apparatus. When it caught up, confirmed. Apex predator contact. The Keth Ural. She knew them from the briefing files the same way she knew any dangerous ecosystem. Catalogued, described, given a threat rating. Functionally territorial. Technologically superior to 60% of known conclave species. Their civilization operated on a culling model they identified what they called inefficiencies in the galaxy's civilizational ecology and removed them, and they had been removing them for 400 years without significant resistance. The dreadnought sat in high orbit, its signal reaching the station in pulses that the apparatus translated with unusual clarity. The Keth Ural, whatever else they were, communicated with the precision of a species that considered ambiguity a form of weakness. Organic contaminant designated human present in conclave space. Expel immediately, or station will be harvested for inefficiency. The Veth calculation was audible to her now. She had spent enough time with them to read the quality of their collective deliberation, the way she could read the difference between a healthy colony and a stressed one. The question running through 40,000 polyps, moving at the speed of their shared chemistry. Is one human worth a war? She asked the apparatus for a channel to the Kethural ship. The Elder Cluster's response arrived immediately. Inadvisible. Protocol requires collective response. Individual contact outside conclave authority. She asked again. The apparatus carried the quality of the Veth's reaction with unusual fidelity. A particular vibrational register that she had come to associate with something she might have called fascination if she were more certain she was reading it correctly. She was asking something she had been told not to do. She was asking again. This was, she gathered, not something that happened in Veth diplomatic experience. Species did not ask twice for things they'd been denied. The Kethural's second signal arrived. Final notation. Compliance expected within 3 standard units. Ashkani walked to the docking section, found the emergency communications array, and opened a channel on the universal distress frequency not because she was in distress, but because the universal distress frequency was the one channel the docking system's access controls couldn't lock without disabling the distress beacon itself, which was a safety-critical system. And she was betting the Veth station design was as conservative about safety systems as every other species she had ever worked with. The channel opened. She spoke carefully. Not with threats she had nothing to threaten with. One human, a geology probe, and half a kit of repair foam was not a military force by any metric she had access to. She informed the Kethural commander that she was logging this engagement on the Conclave's open network, that her log was time-stamped and encrypted with her mission agency's key, and that every species on the Conclave's communication network would receive it within 3 hours. The response took 47 seconds. Unusually long. She'd worked with enough researchers to know what 47 seconds of silence from a superior force meant. Recalculation. Designation. Human. World. Earth. Specify. Your authority. She almost told them she had no authority. She stopped herself. Ashkani. Xenobiologist. Earth. She paused, and let the pause carry what she meant by it. You should look us up. Another silence. Shorter this time. The Veth's observation of her was absolute 40,000 pairs of eyes, registered every word, every biosign, every tremor in her voice that her training and her stubbornness were doing their best to suppress. She was afraid. Her body was not hiding it well at the chemical level. The station's sensory mesh would be reading her cortisol, her elevated heart rate, the slight irregularity in her breathing. She was afraid. And she was still standing at the communications array with her hand on the open channel. The Kethural fleet held position. The Veth's collective deliberation shifted register the chemical signal moving through the station's body at the speed of their shared nervous system. No longer the question of whether one human was worth a war, but something else, something she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. She stayed at the communications array and waited. The station breathed around her, slow and vast, and she breathed with it. The Kethural had a word for what Ashkani was doing. The translation came back as irrational persistence in the face of asymmetric threat. The Veth didn't have a word for it. They were developing one. The boarding probe arrived 6 hours into the standoff. Not a weapon, the Veth sensors confirmed, but a transport vessel. 3 soldiers by the heat signature, making for the station's secondary docking port. A test. She had dealt with enough field situations to recognize the shape of it. When you don't understand a variable, you probe it. You send a small force. You see what it does. She asked the Veth not to interfere. The Elder Cluster's response was a long, complex signal that the apparatus could only partially render. Sequences that meant something like caution, and something like unprecedented, and something that had no translation at all. But they did not seal the secondary port. They watched. She walked to the airlock. She did not bring the geology probe. She did not have a plan in any sense that her mission briefing would have recognized as one. She had something older than a plan, the same instinct that had made her crouch beside a dying subcolony, that had made her push into a collapsing corridor with a 12% survival probability. The instinct that said, meet the thing. Be present with it. Let it know you are real. She sat down, cross-legged on the floor in front of the airlock, the way she had sat watching the dying cluster, and she waited. The airlock cycled. 3 Keth-Ural soldiers entered the corridor tall, heavily built, their exoskeletal armor designed for an atmosphere denser than the station's, their sensory apparatus registering her through what she assumed were standard threat assessment protocols. They stopped 4 meters away. She looked at them. Not up at them, she adjusted her angle slightly, the way she had learned on a dozen worlds to signal attention without submission, presence without confrontation. The look you gave a research subject you wanted to approach. The look you gave something you found genuinely interesting. She asked, through the apparatus, what they ate. The 3 soldiers did not respond. Their stance did not change. But the apparatus, sensitive enough to catch subvocal variations in Keth-Ural atmospheric disturbance, registered something she interpreted as confusion, and confusion, she had found in 11 years of fieldwork, was always an opening. She asked how they navigated between stars, whether they used the same brown dwarf landmarks as the conclave species, or had developed their own reference points. She asked, and this was the one she watched most carefully, because she had learned to read the physical response to this question across 6 different biologies, whether they had names for their dead. The soldier nearest her shifted its weight. Not a threat response. A recalibration. Its threat assessment protocols had been built for creatures that either attacked or submitted, and she was doing neither, and the protocol was trying to find its footing on terrain that wasn't in its library. The other 2 soldiers were very still. She kept asking, slow, genuine, unhurried. The same voice she had used with the dying subcolony, the same voice she used with everything she encountered that was alive and uncertain and looking at her across the vast distance of being a different kind of mind. She was not performing calm. She was calm, in the way that came from accepting that she could not control what happened next, could only be fully present for it. The commander's signal reached the boarding party 11 minutes in. The apparatus caught the edge of it, a single command burst, compressed and tight. She didn't need the translation. She watched the 3 soldiers step back toward the airlock and understood. Retreat. Not because she had won, not because she had threatened or impressed or outmaneuvered them, because she had looked at them, really looked. The way she looked at everything that came within her field of observation and asked them genuine questions, and their engagement protocols had no response category for being asked genuine questions by a creature that was afraid of them and staying anyway. The airlock closed. She remained on the floor for a moment, her legs folded, the repair foam still crusted on her gloves, the biosign monitor recording the slow descent of her heart rate as the adrenaline metabolized. The Keth-Ural fleet signal reached the station 20 minutes later. Departure acknowledgement, no engagement. They were leaving. Not because humanity was stronger, because she was something their models couldn't classify, and unclassifiable things, to a civilization built on catalog deficiencies, were the one variable that could not be optimized around. The Elder Cluster came to her. Not a signal. Not a chemical communication carried through the station's body. Physically, the polyps themselves flowing across the floor toward her, a river of amber gold moving on thousands of tiny legs, the whole elder cluster and then some, tens of thousands of bodies moving with the slow inevitability of a tide. They stopped 2 centimeters from her boot, the whole mass of them, close enough that she could feel their warmth through the floor. They had no word yet for what they wanted to do. The filament extended anyway. She extended one finger. The filament touched the tip of her glove, and the station breathed out long and slow, the deepest exhalation she had felt in the days of its breathing. And somewhere in the distributed nervous system of 40,000 bodies, a new signal passed. Not language, not concept, not the complex chemical grammar they used for every thought they shared. Something simpler, something that had not passed through the Veth's collective mind before, moving from polyp to polyp to polyp in a cascade that the station's own sensory mesh would record and never quite be able to name. It moved through them like a tide moves through water, touching everything, changing the shape of everything it touched, arriving at last at the outermost members of the colony and not stopping there, continuing outward into the slow rhythm of the station's breathing, into the air that was also the station's body, until it reached the walls, and the floor, and the vast exhaling dark beyond.